welcome back to Food in General, a podcast presented by Sunday in General that looks to explore the nuances of food through candid conversation, information exchange, and opinion commentary. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Luke van der Merwe, and today, as part of our Series 1, where we look to understand our food businesses in a post-COVID-19 era, I'll be chatting to Murray Clark, aka Muzz. Muzz is a property developer and the founder and CEO of Neighbourgood Property. Muzz is a former colleague and friend and has built a successful career in the property game over the past 15 years. In this conversation with Muzz, we look through the lens of the landlord and the implications that COVID-19 has had on him and his assets, as well as his approach to rental for the tenants in his buildings. We chat about the future of rental models, rental as a turnover percentage of revenue and the challenges that may arise from that, and the likelihood of how the pre-COVID traditional rental model may change to accommodate flexibility, more landlord CAPEX spend, and a more digital-focused asset management model. My conversations with Muzz are always thought-provoking, and this one was no different. He has incredible insight into the property space, and I hope you enjoy this as much as I did.
What's happening?
Muzz, how are you?
I'm good, and you, boy?
Good, dude. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
How's things your side? Before we jump into it all, how's the family? How's Archie?
Family are good. Archie's good. He's at school today.
Schools are open.
So he's growing up, bro. It's like level 3 for dogs already.
I mean,
he's the best, man. He's cool.
Just to give context to listeners, Archie is Muzz's 9-month-old Pomeranian, and you can follow him on Instagram at Archie the Pom.
Archie the Pomeranian, that's it.
That's awesome.
He started running with me on Sea Point Prom, and he's running at under 6 minutes a K, so he's beating his dad.
To jump straight into it, I think what's cool is that you have a unique perspective in that you are a landlord and developer, but you've also dabbled in retail entrepreneurship. So you understand what both sides of the table are like on lease negotiations. So to just backtrack a little, I think there's a lot of debate and chatter around small independent businesses with leases and their inability to pay the rent, and everyone is sympathizing with them at the moment. But I think it's also important to understand the developer and the landlord's perspective and what it means to them when they aren't getting these rentals. So I don't know if you can dive sort of into it and explain what the consequences are from a developer or a landlord's point of view. And I know everyone's situation is different, but just sort of sum it up in a nutshell, what the consequences are for them when they aren't receiving these rentals.
I think the biggest issue in respect to not receiving rentals is, as landlords and developers, we've obviously got fixed operating costs and fixed costs of capital in respect to any given investment. So if one has to look at a shopping center and let's say it's worth 100 million rand for argument's sake, the bank have lent us generally approximately 60 to 70% of that. They expect a return. Investors have lent us the balance of the equity required, and there's a return expectation there as well. Ultimately, everything comes down to cash flow and flows upward. So what's happened now, at least in my own properties, is that we've had to negotiate adjustments to our debt repayment profiles with the banks on the basis of what we can afford to pay. And that's really a cash flow calculation. Like any business, there's income and there's expenses. And if your income completely dries up, your ability to pay expenses does the same. And so the banks have had to come to the party. And it's difficult because loans are structured in different ways. Some are interest only, some are fixed I have one asset as an example where there's a fixed repayment profile, which makes it almost impossible to change. So what the bank have had to do is essentially lend me more money, which they will get a return on, so that I can afford to meet repayments over the next 6 months. So I'm not able to meet commitments on debt for a particular asset because the cash flow is not there to service it. So the banks are having to lend us additional cash. So that was one particular asset, which is difficult because there's fixed debt in place. On other assets, the guys, it's really just been about playing complete open cards and taking a 6-month view to what cash flow looks like and adjusting repayment profiles accordingly. And all of the banks, as I understand it, have been coming to the party as much as possible to adjust debt repayment profiles. As I understand it, a lot of the property funds have also taken a fairly reasonable stance in respect to cash flow and trying to help tenants, etc., etc. But I've also heard horror stories of landlords who haven't come to the party and who've been demanding rental, or in some cases deferring rental, but that doesn't really solve the problem, because assuming you've got a 1-year lease or a two-year lease and you are unable to pay your rental for 3 months as a result of COVID, all that happens is that the impact of not paying rental for the 3 months, if it is deferred to the balance of your lease, places a higher requirement on you to make more money to service what you've basically not had the ability to pay in the short term. So I don't really believe that deferment route is the way to go. I feel like at the moment we're basically freezing time and everyone's just trying to buckle up and save as much money as possible to survive and get through the other end. And the biggest variable is we don't really know what the other end looks like. The impact has been substantial. It is substantial on landlords as well, but we've got to come to the party as much as we can. Otherwise, at the end of it, we're not going to have any income to collect anyway, whether we like it or not.
I think that's the catch-22 of the whole thing, is that a lot of retail businesses and food businesses, most certainly the independent ones, and the bigger ones like Spur Holdings and the bigger sort of franchises, are all taking the stance of, well, I'm not going to pay rent and kick me out if you dare, because you're not really going to find anyone to replace me.
I believe that if you can't trade, and I won't get into the legals around force majeure and what that looks like. If you can't trade as a result of what's going on, I don't believe you should be paying rental from a landlord's perspective. I think that every private landlord has a different stance, and you may or may not have a good landlord that will support you in your efforts, because quite rightly, as tenants and smaller businesses say, if you come out on the other side, who you're actually going to let to is just not the economic position we find ourselves in now. Is not conducive to starting food businesses and retail businesses of any sort. There's huge pressure on pocket at the moment, so I just can't see a bounce back right now of tenants coming out of the woodwork for the next 18 months at least. You should be paying rental based on the turnover levels you are able to achieve with the space that you've got as a percentage of your top line. So I think what's really important, like landlords have with banks, landlords need to have with tenants, is complete transparency and just playing open cards, because it's only through a collaborative approach that we're going to be able to get through this together. And I've seen too often sort of tenants and landlords butting heads. It's just not really conducive to the spirit of trying to get through global epidemic like we're facing. From a listed point of view, they are not heavily geared. So the listed sector has regulations around how much gearing you have. So gearing is essentially how much debt you have as a percentage of your gross asset base, and generally that floats between 30 and 45%. They have institutional shareholders like Sunlum and Stanlib and PIC and all of those good things. So they're a much better position to take a view because they've got cash flow reserves that they have available to deal with. This is a very unique circumstance, but to deal with things. So what's happening is they're just not distributing income. And if you are a REIT, which is a real estate investment trust, in terms of the REIT legislation, you actually have to distribute your income, but that is now changing as a result of what's happening. And so what's happening is that they're just not distributing income to shareholders.
I guess to simplify it, is it a case of you have a private landlord and you're a small food business, and it's whether or not he comes to the party or not, and if he does, you'll be able to survive this. If he doesn't, you're going to have to make the hard call. And on the other side of it, if you are in a building that's maybe run by Redefine or Growth Point, they've got the cash reserve to sort of say, cool, we'll discount 100%, so that you guys can survive this. So if you're a food business sitting here right now and we want to move forward, we've maybe got a little bit of cash flow, we've been discounted 100%, maybe our lease is coming up for negotiation. What is the industry saying about rental models going forward? Me and you have bounced around the idea of turnover, or percentage of turnover. Is that a realistic outcome? Like, are the traditional landlords that we are used to dealing with, are they going to suddenly shift everything to this turnover percentage as a rental model?
I think what might happen is base rates that get introduced that are far below market pre-COVID, and turnover top-ups. So I think what's happening is that pre-COVID, you would have a base rate of, let's say, 250 Rand a square for 100 square meter premises, which is 25 grand. The market's going to bring that down to 15 grand. And there'll be a turnover clause which will link to that sort of a mark. And my belief is that if you take a 12-month view, you'll be able to structure a deal that makes sense for both. I don't know if my worry about turnover only is that as a landlord, it puts you in the direct hands of the tenant itself. So assuming there's a management issue or someone's stealing out of the till, how do you protect, and this is actually a conversation I'd like to ask you as well, is how do you manage the business processes of a tenant who's not performing because of human error or whatever it might be? How do you manage that risk in respect to, if it is a turnover only deal, how does a landlord manage that risk?
I don't think there's any straight answer to that. It's super complicated because I think first and foremost, as a landlord, you have to be confident in the operator that you're putting in the space.
Correct. Yeah.
And me and you over the past 18 months have been in that position where we've asked people for business plans and menus and cost of food and what the return on this will be and that will be, and we just haven't got it. So I think as a landlord, there's a responsibility to yourself to ensure that the operator understands what's going on. And if the operator doesn't understand what's going on, understand the support structure around the operator. Do they have investors? What do the investors bring to the table? You know, that sort of thing. It's such a tricky one because on the other end of it is that as an operator with a turnover clause only, I could get complacent. And even though my business runs smoothly, I can drop my marketing efforts. You know, as long as I've got enough to pay staff and cover food costs, my rent's sort of going up and down with my income and or with my revenue, and I'm going to be generating the same income anyway.
I think there needs to be a real balance in terms of turnovers that are appropriate, sector appropriate. So depending on whether it's food, retail, clothing, groceries, etc., etc. And I think there's going to be a lot more open book process in respect to understanding what turnovers and projections look like before you enter into a lease agreement. Because if we are relying on your ability to turn over X, Y, and Z amount, we essentially then as landlords become your partners in business, which I think is the future. I think there's just been this separation up to date. Landlords are responsible for what landlords do, tenants are responsible for what tenants do. And I think there's going to be a lot more of negotiation. You started seeing it in the UK before COVID even started. There's turnover deals in place with minimum base rates and top ups of certain. So it becomes far more of a private equity arrangement than a traditional landlord-tenant relationship. I don't think surety, depending on the CAPEX outlay of tenants, I just can't see surety clauses coming in as much as they were. Tenants having to put 3 months deposits in and pay exorbitant rentals. I just can't see it happening anymore, because I think that it's a case of supply and demand, and physical space is not necessarily in demand at the moment. So like any commodity, if the demand is not there, you're not going to be able to charge for it. I just think the whole arrangement is going to turn on its head. But I also think that there's a requirement to introduce industry norms in respect to what is actually appropriate at a turnover level. Is it 6%? Is it 8%? Is it 10%? And for bodies in respective industries, if it's food and beverage, retail, whatever it might be, not based on historical data, but based on what the next 24 months looks like.
But it's going to require collaboration, and it's going to require both parties to come to the table. And
correct.
I know that the food industry and all the small businesses out there are knocking at the door, wanting to come in. How do we open the door? How do we chat to the redefines and the growth points and the private landlords that are being somewhat hostile? What does it look like?
So the best way, there's two industry bodies, the SAPOA, which is the South African Property Owners Association, that has a very strong board of industry professionals that I know really well. And then there's the South African Council of Shopping Centres. And both are governing bodies in respect to property owners across South Africa. And so, in my opinion, if there are similar related boards in the food industry or whatever that looks like, the best thing would be to engage at that level and actually have an open discussion about what it's going to take to get through this period. And I'm not talking about, mass smart South African property owners discussion. I'm talking about an independent body of foodies and retailers who represent smaller moms and pops and independents, where the lifeblood of their living, etc., comes from. And so I would have those discussions, and I think the guys would be really open to it, or guys and girls, because I don't think it's just guys, because small retail is, as a percentage of our workforce, a significant amount. It employs a massive amount of people. So I really think that it's in our interest to make sure that not only just for income that independents survive, but for the whole South African society. We don't want to see unemployment rates plummet to further levels. And if we have the ability to help prevent that through collaboration, we should really be doing it. I would definitely be happy to set up that sort of forum up if it was something that we could do.
And people need to look at it from just a fundamental point of view, where let's scale back, but with the objective of keeping people employed, putting food on tables, and giving people lifeblood is essentially what it is. I think the document that we spoke of, which, just to give listeners context, was a paper issued by Deloitte's property department. And one of the things I took from that was the idea of real estate as a service, and how landlords are going to have to look at their value proposition in a post-COVID era and look at their asset from not only a digital not only a physical asset, but also digital, and actually show the tenant where the value lies. I think like you said, no one's going to jump at opening retail or food businesses, at least within the next 24 months. So from your perspective as a landlord and a developer, and I know it's something that's close to your heart and you have a lot of ideas about, how are you increasing value propositions, and what should the likes of the cafes and coffee shops and delis start asking for from landlords?
We have to take that approach because we have no other option. Otherwise, we're just going to lose our tenants. So the function of just renting an office space for 3 years or 5 years, collecting a 2-month deposit, charging 180 Rand a square meter, and picking up the keys in 5 years' time is just not happening anymore. There's a requirement for massive amount of flexibility. There's a requirement for value adds. What do value adds look like? I mean, front-end digital apps, minimal deposits, if any at all, CAPEX commitments in respect to making sure that you don't have to take a lot of money out of your own pocket to fit out your office or your shop, value-added events, a seamless omni-channel approach, whether it be retail or offices, or industrial for that matter, or residential for that matter. We all obviously are living on our phones, and at a touch point level, it's the easiest way for us to manage the way we live. So that's never been something that landlords have had to deal with. And now you're seeing, housing as a service and software as a service come together in respect to how to make the life of a tenant that much more seamless in respect to tenant experience. And then customer service, which has not been a term that landlords have even understood prior to COVID. And, customer service is something you would think of in a food business, in terms of how you greet your customers. What is the way you interact with your customers say about your brand? And so I think brand generally, customer service is going to be massively important. And I don't think that those are things you can do if you're not authentic. So if you're not real, I think it will be shone through. You can't just say you're going to be a particular way and then not actually be that way. You actually have to believe it fully. So it will be interesting to see how landlords come around. I just think as landlords, we have to be thinking like an independent food operator. We have to know the name of our customers. We have to deliver experiences for them that are better than our competitors. And for too long, it's just been the case of rental escalations and collecting rent, etc., sending an invoice once a month, and if necessary, kicking you out, locking you out of the door, etc. That's just going to change completely.
I think there's been such a disconnect traditionally and pre-COVID in specific food businesses and landlords not understanding how thin the margins are in the food business.
Yeah.
And it's just this 3-year-long lease with a fixed rental escalation, and it's just not sustainable. So I do see a shift towards, like you said, flexible leases, 6-month, 3-month, 9-month, without a heavy CAPEX outlay, with no deposits. And I think maybe there's some comfort in restaurants that are having to close now, and there's quite a few globally and in South Africa, in that the closure might just be temporary, and that if they can stick it out or close and just hold on for the next 10 to 12 months, there's going to be a large supply of space that can be occupied at very little risk to sort of get them going again.
Absolutely.
Which is an awesome thought, because the restaurant model as it currently stands pre-COVID was quite flawed in that it's a heavy CAPEX outlay for minimal returns.
Yeah.
So I think it's awesome that these spaces, and there's a shift in landlord perspective and understanding that, cool, we need to start being more flexible. We need to give 3-month leases, 6-month leases, pop-ups here and there, just so that they can start building their brand slowly. And I also think the shift in putting capital into more sustainable areas is a shift that now has to happen, and it has to go into SME, because what's more sustainable than decreasing the unemployment rate, and we know that the unemployment rate is directly related to the success and failures of our small businesses.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of comfort in that. I hope that the bigger funds are taking that view, and the private landlords will start taking that view if they haven't already. I think that pretty much covers it, Maz. I think we've tackled quite a bit. I would like to ask you if you're open to anyone who's going to listen to this or is listening to this that is in a position where they are either fighting a landlord or struggling with a lease negotiation, or maybe just want to bounce some ideas about how to approach the landlord, that they contact you. And I'll link your contact details, like they say, in the show notes. But yeah, Maz, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you chatting to me.
My pleasure.
I don't know if you've got any other closing remarks for our small business.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question of, as you say, surviving at the moment for small business. And, I've just reaffirmed how important it is to just be transparent in respect to where you are with your landlord, and if necessary, making hard decisions in respect to, if you are dealing with a landlord that's really difficult, and the long-term prognosis is not there and the trajectory is not there, is to make the hard decisions now so that you can create a sustainable business later. And if that means shutting down and cutting your losses now, I would advise it with calculated thought, obviously, just simply because you want to be working with people that you like and that you trust. And when you're working with landlords who offer both of those things, it's much easier to create a more sustainable relationship that's symbiotic in respect to everything generally. So I think if you're lucky enough to have a decent landlord who's open to helping you get through, that's obviously first prize. If not, then the decisions are hard to make sometimes, but I would advise being fairly decisive. At the same time, looking at your business model in respect to what it's going to look like for the next 24 months and making those adjustments now. And if that means cutting your rental costs in half, or cutting your whatever it might be in half with your landlord, etc., rather be upfront and do that immediately, because maybe the best model, and this is something the industry needs to discuss, is what is a sustainable food business moving forward, and what is the combination of click and collect, sit down versus delivery? What is the impact of the delivery costs that exists at the moment? How do we help solve that problem? Is it a combination of taking deliveries in-house? Does it mean that we now need to start looking at alternative ways to reduce OPEX and the cost of doing business? So I think there's a lot that can be discussed, and finding solutions, because it's quite depressing at the moment, the time that we're living in, and we ultimately need to try and look at the next 18 to 24 months with a view to come out of it positively and take all of these learnings that we've had, so that we can be better for it as people and as businesses. So it'll be good to go through that process and have other discussions with you when we get there.
And an introduction of a pandemic clause into leases.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm not joking. I'm not joking. If I was negotiating a lease right now, I'd be like, okay, cool, but I want to include a pandemic clause.
For sure.
But
no, completely. It's completely. It makes sense.
Where is the first place you're going to go dine out when you can?
Oh, goodness. Jeez, you're putting me on the spot. I'll probably go sit at the general store.
I don't know. The general store is doing some awesome home meals, so make sure you order them.
Dude, I'm getting fat eating all of the stuff that she makes. Sorry.
Don't worry. My level of comfort eating is right up there
completely.
now.
Thank you for having me.
Maz, thank you. enjoy the rest of your afternoon and send love to the family and Archie.
Awesome.
And we'll be
Thank you
chatting
so
soon.
much.
Awesome, Maz.
Cheers, guys.
Bye. Bye.
And that's another food in general conversation. I hope you all enjoyed my chat with Maz and what he had to say, and I hope you gained some insight into what the future of property may look like and the role that it has to play in the future of our small businesses. Next week I'm going to be chatting to John and Rob from Rosetta Roastery here in Cape Town, and I'm hopefully going to get an insight into life in the cafe and the roastery during COVID-19 and what the future of coffee and cafes look like. If you have any ideas for the show or you just want to get in touch, please hit me up on Instagram at SundayInGeneral or send me an email at sundayingeneral.com. Till next week, cheers guys.